We're live.
So welcome to the second of four tax workshops. And today it's going to be on the current education funding system.
All right, thank you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Julia Richter. I work for the Joint Fiscal Office and I focus on education finance in Vermont. I'm also joined by my colleague who also focuses on education finance, Ezra Holben, so the two of us really are working on supporting the legislature in terms of understanding ed finance in Vermont. Going to go ahead and share my screen. And also John Gray, who is our Education Finance Legislative Counsel. So any legal questions, I will be sure to punt to John because he is the legal expert. So diving into it, we'll start out with an overview of education finance in Vermont. As Vice Chair Canfield mentioned, this is focusing on Vermont's current law education finance system. We will talk about education expenditures and education funding. So talk about the non-property tax sources and then property taxes, non-homestead and homestead property tax. I do want to note that this whole presentation is focused on the statewide education fund. So we're not talking about the millions of federal funding that come into the state, really just focusing on those statewide dollars. So education finance in Vermont. As we all know, it is different from other states. It's a unique system that couples a statewide funding formula with local property tax administration. School district spending is determined at the local level and at the state level, but specifically school boards are setting budgets that must be approved by voters. The General Assembly sets yields and property tax rates annually at a level necessary to fund all education expenditures. We'll talk more later in the presentation about how that works and what that actually means. There's two types of property taxes in Vermont. There's homestead property tax and non-homestead. They have different rates. We'll talk about what those different rates are, how they're calculated, and what fits into each of those buckets. And the other high-level introduction to the ed finance system is that since the Brigham decision in 1997, the funding formula has a homestead property tax rate that's a function of a district's per pupil spending. So districts' rates in Vermont are no longer a function of property wealth in the district. They really vary in proportion to a school district's spending decisions, per pupil spending. So a brief history. I know that the words are really small. These slides are also posted on the Ways and Means Committee page on the sidebar next to the links. And really are meant to be more of a resource if you are to go back and look at the slides later on. But just thinking about, where over the past, however many, 20 or so years, how we gotten to where ed finance is currently in Vermont. So prior to 1997, Vermont had a foundation formula to fund its education system. And the way that it was structured led to inequities in towns' tax rates and also per pupil spending. There was a court case that determined there were inequities and it was unconstitutional, which ultimately led to the passage of Act 60 in 1997. There have been a number of other significant pieces of legislation since Act 60. And I've included only Act 60 here as sort of a grounding of where did we start to build this new system. So essentially what it means is that a town's property wealth no longer affects its education tax rate. Under Act 60, towns with the same per pupil spending have the same homestead tax rate regardless of their property wealth. So that's very quick how we got to sort of where we are today. But now thinking about within a year, the education finance timeline and how it works. And in some ways, it's arbitrary where I picked the starting block to be, because this is really a circular process, right? But intuitively, I think it's helpful to think about where school boards start to prepare their budgets. So they begin preparing their budgets, that's usually in early fall. And they're preparing those budgets over the course of the fall. And then on December 1st, the Commissioner of Taxes, in consensus with the Joint Fiscal Office and collaboration with the Agency of Education, the Commissioner publishes what's called the December 1st letter. And this is sort of a preliminary starting point for the current status of the education fund using our best available data. It's really a ministerial task. It lays out in statute exactly how we have to solve the tax rates and tax bill changes. But it's a starting point. So the December 1st letter is published, and then school boards continue preparing those budgets, warn the budgets to their voters, and then school districts put those budgets to a vote to their local voters. Usually that's on town meeting day, where Vermonters vote on their school district's budget. And then the General Assembly is continuing throughout the session, and the General Assembly passes the yield bill, which essentially sets property taxes at the level estimated that's needed to fully fund the education fund, fully fund all of the voter approved budgets and any other choices or policy decisions the legislature has made. The Department of Taxes then sets those spending adjusted property tax rates based off of what was passed in the yield bill. And that happens on or before June 30th. Late summer, early fall, towns start to administer those property taxes. And then taxpayers over the course of the year are paying their education property taxes to the statewide education fund, and school districts are implementing their budgets. So it really is a circular process. So that's high level, sort of level setting. What is the world that we're talking about? But moving into education expenditures. Again, we're talking about the statewide education fund. So the first piece that I think is helpful to think about is local level education expenditures. So as we know, each school district is building an annual budget. Those budgets require local voters' approval. And from a high level perspective, we can kind of think of those budgets as having two primary pots, two buckets. One are the offsetting revenues that the school district is receiving. So this is everything like state and federal categorical aid. So if they're getting dollars specifically for special education or universal school meals, flexible pathways, transportation, those dollars are sitting here into offsetting revenues. That includes if another school district is paying tuition into that school district. If the district has surpluses, deficits, reserves, that all fits into this bucket of offsetting revenues. And then essentially what we do is we say, okay, here's the school district budget, subtract out all of the offsetting revenues, and then everything that's left over, we call education spending. And this is a technical term in education finance. And education spending really refers to a school district's budget minus its offsetting revenues. We'll talk about this amount a little bit later on. This is an important number as well because it impacts the district's homestead property tax rate. But we'll talk about how it does that. So we have all of these school districts building their budgets based off of local decisions, state decisions, federal decisions, putting them to a vote. We have that happening across the state. And then we zoom out and we say, okay, at the state level, what do education expenditures look like? And the Ed Fund is essentially the statewide aggregated costs of public education. It includes all school budgets, except for those federal dollars that we're not talking about. And so again, we can think of the Ed Fund sort of in two buckets. We can think of the first bucket as the education payment. And this is literally the sum of all of the education spending that we just spoke about. Sum of all school districts' education spending. And then we have all other expenditures coming out of the ed fund. So these are those categorical aid programs we were talking about. One-time appropriations and other operating and administrative costs at the state level for the education fund. The Agency of Education, its primary funding is not coming out of the education fund. Again, I know these numbers are really small. This is just to point you to resources that you may see floating around the State House. They're also available on the Joint Fiscal Office website. But the education fund outlook is, you can sort of think of it as a balance. It's not a balance sheet, but you can think of it as a balance sheet of the education fund. It's showing the ins, the outs of the education fund, the stabilization reserve, how much surplus is there. So if you do look at these slides, you can see there's a chunk on the education fund outlook that outlines all of those appropriations that come out of the education fund in a fiscal year. So what we see here, one of the lines in the education fund outlook is reflective of the sum of all of that education spending. We were talking about that education payment. This is about 80% of all appropriations out of the education fund are the aggregated education spending cost. The bulk of that are personnel costs. So I know I'm moving fast, but I want to make sure to save time for questions. So that's a high-level overview of education expenditures coming out of the statewide ed fund. So moving into education funding. The ed fund has two primary, again, sticking with the theme of two buckets. Now we can think about the ed fund as having sort of two buckets of revenue sources: property taxes and non-property tax revenue sources. So what you can see here is that the majority of the education fund, over 50%, is funded by property taxes. But we also have all of sales and use tax dedicated to the education fund, portion of meals and rooms tax, a portion of purchase and use tax, the entire lottery transfer. Last year, there was a one-time general fund transfer into the education fund of $25 million and a number of other revenue sources coming into the ed fund. Again, if you were to be looking at the ed fund outlook, you would see in more detail the actual numbers associated with each one of these revenues, right? So you would see that we have sales and use tax, that we have a portion of purchase and use. You would also see those property taxes aggregated to come into the statewide ed fund, the homestead property tax, the property tax credit, which we will talk about in more detail, and the non-homestead property tax. So getting into property taxes, and taking a step back and thinking about the intuition of property taxes and how they're set. Essentially, every year, these education property tax rates are set to keep the education fund fully balanced. So what we do is we talk through education fund expenditures, right? We're aggregating up all of the statewide education costs. That's what the education fund is encapsulating, right? So we take that full pot of the ed fund and we say, okay, this is how much is going to be funded from non-property tax revenues. The remainder, we still need to fund. And that's where property taxes come in. So the bigger that education fund, or the smaller the education expenditures, the higher the non-property tax revenues or the lower the non-property tax revenues, all of those are going to impact how much property tax needs to be raised. Because the property tax is making up that difference of dollars that need to be funded, out of the ed fund, but are not raised by non-property. So that's what this first bullet point is talking about here. We're setting the ed tax rates to ensure the ed fund is fully funded. It's determined by subtracting the non-property tax revenues from the total uses in the ed fund. There are two tax bases subject to statewide education tax with different rates. We have non-homestead property and homestead property. I've included a little bit of legislative language here, but in non-legislative language, sort of the way to think about homestead property is where does somebody live, their principal dwelling and the surrounding land. So that's what homestead property is. Non-homestead property is everything else that's subject to property tax. Before going into the two categories, I want to touch on the common level of appraisal, the CLA. So we know that Vermont has a statewide education fund. It does not have a statewide reappraisal system. So what that means is that there are communities reappraising at different times across the state, but are all paying property tax into the statewide education fund. So the common level of appraisal, the CLA, is a mathematical statistical mechanism used to account for those different appraisal schedules across the state. Right, so if we have a town that hasn't appraised for 20 years and its properties are listed way below fair market value, and a town that just appraised this year and its properties are 100% of fair market value, the CLA is going to adjust the town that hasn't appraised for a long time up to fair market value to ensure everybody's paying their fair share into the education fund. I'm not going to get further into the math unless that's helpful. We do have a CLA 101 on JFO's website. But essentially when discussing tax rates, we, JFO, use the term equalized because this is referring to what the tax rate would be if everybody was at 100% of fair market value. It's a way to compare across towns regardless of when they were last appraised. The term actual is the tax rate that folks are seeing on their bills. So adjusting that tax rate to make sure folks are paying their fair share. So moving into the two classifications of property, starting with non-homestead property. And this is that bucket of everything that's not a homestead. So non-homestead property, it receives a uniform tax rate. This is also set annually by the legislature in the yield bill. It's a policy choice. And it's applied to businesses, second homes, apartments, deer camp. And it's a uniform rate regardless of what that property is. The homestead property tax is the tax on property that qualifies as a homestead. So people's principal dwelling and all surrounding land to that principal dwelling. And the homestead property tax rate in each town is dependent on its locally approved education spending per pupil. We'll talk about what that means, and the statewide property yield. We'll also talk about what that means. But this is where that education spending number that we were talking about, I don't know, 10 slides ago is coming back up. So a lot of information on this slide. Again, more of a resource slide. But when we're talking about education spending per pupil, that's also a technical term in statute. And per pupil is essentially referring to per weighted pupils. And so what are pupil weights? Well, they're set in statute. They were changed in Act 127 a few years ago. And they're used to adjust student counts to address differing student needs or different circumstances. So this table is outlining the different pupil weighting categories and corresponding weights that are in statute were changed in Act 127, but they include grade level weights, a weight for students from economically deprived backgrounds, English learners, there's a sparsity weight, so if a school district is geographically sparse, and a small school weight, which is only applicable for sparse districts. It's a way of getting to that necessary small school. So the way that they work is we take the Agency of Education takes pretty much on average the number of kids in schools and then applies these weights to these certain categories of students to increase the number of weighted students in districts or in areas where there are more needs or different circumstances. So these weights are added to the average pupil weighting count, And that's where we get this term, long-term weighted average daily membership, which it's a lot of words, but essentially means the number of kids in schools after accounting for these different needs that are spelled out in statute. So this is where we get into that homestead property tax and how the local homestead property tax rate is calculated. And it's calculated to adjust to account for differences in per pupil spending, right? That per weighted pupil spending. So the way that it works is, and I will say, some of us think in formulas and equations, some of us think in words. The two are saying the same thing here. So the words are really just spelling out what's happening here in the equation. But essentially what we do is we have a dollar minimum. So regardless of what a district has per pupil spending, they're going to have a homestead tax rate of at least $1. And then we say, okay, what is that district's per pupil spending? We calculate that per pupil spending by taking the education spending. That's what we talked about before, right? It's the school district's budget minus its offsetting revenues. We're going to take that education spending of the district and then divide it by its number of weighted pupils, what we just spoke about. And that's giving us this weighted per pupil ed spending amount that differs by district, assuming those districts don't have the same education spending and weighted pupil counts. So for every district, we're calculating their per pupil education spending. And then the district's tax rate is calculating by dividing that per pupil spending by the statewide property yield. And this statewide property yield is a number that's also set in the yield bill. And this is why it's a really important number, because it's impacting every school district's homestead property tax rate, right? The higher the property yield, the higher the per pupil ed spending can be for a lower tax rate. So that's quick high-level overview of the homestead property tax rate. And now diving in a little bit deeper into the property tax credit. So often people say, you know, some Vermonters pay their education taxes based on property or based on income, or there's a property tax credit or income sensitivity or circuit breaker. All of those terms are referring to the property tax credit that exists within Vermont's education finance system. So this is specific for that homestead property tax. And essentially what it is a tax credit on the property tax based on income. About 2/3 of Vermont households receive some sort of property tax credit based on their income. And that goes against their homestead property tax total bill. The credit is on a lag, meaning that it's applied to the following year's tax bill. So a household earns a property tax credit based off of their homestead value, their income, the property tax rates, and then that credit that they earn in 1 year is then applied to the following year's tax bill. And it's determined based off of a taxpayer's income. So there's a couple of different brackets used for the calculation of a property tax credit. And a couple of different parameters. One is the household income. Household income is a specific way of measuring income, specific for the property tax credit. And this is essentially, and John can speak to its real legal definition, but essentially you can think of pretty much all of the income being earned under that household roof. So everybody living in that house, summing up all of their income, and that's the household income. There are some exclusions, and that's the intuition. There are a few parameters or brackets for that household income that are built into statute. So there's the 47,000 is included in statute. 90,000 is included in statute. And what those mean are they go into the calculation of the property tax credit and how big or small it will be. So essentially, for households up to 47,000 of income, the property tax credit may be used on the first 400,000 of their house site value. This is also where the piece circuit breaker comes into play. There's additional, and I think, in the appendix, I have more details about what that means. But essentially what it means is households under 47,000 of income can only pay a certain percentage of their income towards property taxes. Once you hit $47,001 up to 90,000, the circuit breaker no longer exists. And you can pay the property tax credit may be used on the first 400,000 of the house site value. Above 90,000, the property tax credit may be used on the first 225,000 of the house site value. And then there's some point at which case it will never be cheaper for a household to pay based on income versus property. That break-even point where the lines cross, it's always gonna be cheaper for them to pay on property. And that number is calculated in consensus with JFO annually, JFO and tax annually, and this year it's 115,000. So this number is not set in statute. It's a function of the yields that have been set by the General Assembly. I do want to note here that we have these different parameters. Also in the appendix is a table spelling out the calculation. If you fit into this, and this is your house site value, here's how the property tax credit is calculated. But also note that the property tax credit is considered a negative revenue in the education fund, and you'll see that in the education fund outlook. So the larger the property tax credit being paid out of the education fund, out of the state, the higher the whole education fund becomes, right? Because we have this education fund that first we're accounting for all of the expenditures. If you think of the property tax credit as an expenditure, it's growing the amount of revenue that needs to be raised, which then means property taxes, all else equal, need to grow to pay for that increased credit. So it's sort of this, it's that puzzle of, you pull one lever here, going to impact other pieces of the education fund. Here are a few resources that have JFOs, Ed Finance materials, AOE has some data online, and the Department of Taxes also has a lot of resources for interpreting property taxes. So I will stop there. I have saved enough time for questions, and I know I went through a lot, so I guess I will leave it up. Yes.
You may not have the answer at your fingertips, but the two numbers you just mentioned of the income section, the 47,000, 90,000 that are in statute, have those numbers ever been adjusted in statute by the legislature since the program was first put in place?
I don't know off the top of my head, John, do you know?
I think those are the original numbers. I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure these at least have not been adjusted in many, many years.
I will also put in another plug, JFO's fiscal facts, which we put out usually in March, has a property tax relief history going back into the 1970s. So you can literally look through and see, okay, when was the 400 brought down from 500, when those tweaks were or were not made.
Thank you.
Following up his question, so with the running forward in time, the 47 and the 90,000, does that impact the overall availability of funds or the ability to raise funds or the need to raise funds?
So
The question is, should we be looking at that? Yeah.
well, I will say, should you? Totally a policy choice.
Yeah.
Up to you and what your goals are. The 47 and 90,000 are not, they're numbers written into statute, so they're not changing over time. The one piece of the property tax credit that is changing, or the pieces of the property tax credit that are changing annually are not these parameters, but the income yield and the property yield that are being set in the yield bill. So essentially what there's and this.
Is that a sort of offset then?
No, so this is also in appendix. But essentially the way that we are calculating the property tax credit is we're saying, okay, how much would you pay on property? How much would you pay on income? If you would pay less on income than you paid on property, the difference is what the credit is. So you can think about in terms of levers, by increasing or decreasing how much you would pay on income and increasing and decreasing how much you would pay on property. That's really where the change is happening. Does that answer your question?
Well enough.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you. Just a clarification on the 47,000 and lower. On the maximum of 10% of your income with your tax bill for the first 400,000, or just, is that how that works?
For under 47,000.
Correct.
So for under 47,000, this is also in the appendix. As you can see how it's broken out here, I know it's small, but essentially what it says is for under 10,000, there's a tax cap of 0.5% of the household income. Between 10,000 and 25,000, there's a tax cap of 1.5% of income, and 25,000 to 47,000 of 2%. So that's on the property tax side. That's borne by the education fund. There's also a municipal property tax credit circuit breaker, which is borne by the general fund. And there are two different parameters there. Less than 10,000, a cap of 1%, and 10,000 to 47,000, a cap of 3%.
Thank you.
Back a ways about CLA, and so I get it, having been through the reassessment process in my town and changing our CLA. I don't recall whether the CLA, does it come into play in any way on non-homestead?
Yes.
So it's, okay, so it affects the tax rate for the education.
Precisely. So the way that the CLA works, is it's done annually by the tax department. And essentially what it's doing is it's looking at the property values that are listed on the grand list for that town and recent sales, and looking at how are the property values on the grand list comparing to recent sales. And so if on the grand list, for instance, say a home is listed at 200,000, but identical homes in that same town are selling for 400,000, double. It's fair to assume that what's on the grand list is outdated, right? That home is worth more than what is listed there. It just hasn't been reappraised yet. The same is true for businesses or any other non-homestead property. So what the CLA does is it's essentially saying, okay, how much do we need to adjust the tax rate to make sure that at the end, the bill is reflective of if that property were to be appraised at fair market value. So another way to think about it is, in theory, mathematically, it's the same of applying a CLA adjustment to literally raise the property value. The CLA is applied to the tax rate because it makes it easier to administer when thinking about municipal property taxes versus statewide education property taxes, the CLA, it's easier to put against the property tax rate. But mathematically, it would be exactly the same if you were to put it against the value of the property.
So that raised the question to me. So I sort of assumed the CLA was based on the last assessment. And that if your town just had an assessment, and now it's just been done. What you're saying is it's still looked at by the tax. And it could still be adjusted even because they're applying the same modeling across the board.
Yes. So if a town was. If the tax department was looking and say, this town is currently appraised at 100% of fair market value. Great, it has a CLA of 1. We don't need to adjust it at all. Rather, it's looking at, okay, this town is overappraised, so we need to bring it back down so they're not paying too much. Or underappraised, so we need to bring it up so they're paying more. Because all property taxes for education are all statewide property taxes. It's all going into the same pot of money.
And those calculations are done by the tax department.
Correct.
In a way, it may not matter when you were last appraised. They're just looking and applying that formula to every town.
Correct. It's called the equalization study. And the tax department does have some really great resources that spell out how they do the equalization study, what's being looked at, what time, how many years they're looking at, how big of a, like where the boundaries are. So lots of great resources from tax about that.
Well, so then based on that, again, like in Guilford, and we had a reassessment done, and the notions I understood was that we were 15% on the side of 1 was the kind of the benchmark by which you had to do it. But are you adjusting everything? Is the tax department adjusting everything to 1 every single year? Or is there a flex area in there?
So a couple of pieces here.
Or do I understand what I'm talking about?
No, you didn't really. A couple of pieces. One is the question of when should a community be appraised? In the past, that was done by, there were some benchmarks that if the CLA falls above or below a certain amount, need to reappraise, or if the coefficient of dispersion, COD,
Right.
falls above or below a certain benchmark, the community needs to reappraise. So that's one piece of the puzzle of when to go through the reappraisal process. The other piece of the puzzle is every year, communities are paying into the statewide education fund. So every year, the tax department needs to calculate the CLAs to ensure that things are as accurate and as up to date as they should be. The other piece I will say, because we're talking about the CLA, or I guess 2 pieces. One is the CLA has not been used as a policy lever to raise more or less revenue. The CLA is not also included in the yield bill as, oh, if we adjust it, then we can raise more or raise less from a certain community. No, it's just saying, okay, we have a state that has all of these different appraisal schedules. Let's make sure that everybody's up to the same level to be taxed on. Yes.
Well, so, yes, but, so the state doesn't have a policy about adjusting the rate in order to raise more money, but the market itself does that. So like in my community, I have people whose property taxes have gone up because a neighbor's property was sold for much more than it was worth the week before it sold in the books. And so everything starts to adjust upward just by the market. And so, I mean, I realize that's just an issue. It's a tension that's at play. Yeah.
Yes, and I think two pieces that to note about that. One is when we think about the ed fund, we're aggregating the total number of expenditures, we're taking out the non-property revenues, everything else is raised on property, right? If the non-property revenues are staying the same and the total expenditures are staying the same, the amount that needs to be raised on property is not changing.
That's right.
Tax rate.
So when you think about the calculation of a tax bill, you've got the value of your home multiplied by the tax rate. So if the value of your home is going way up, but the tax bill is still the same, right? We still need to raise the same amount of revenue. The tax rate is gonna go down in order to adjust for that. We only see the increase in bills when there are other factors at play, right? You may see an increase in bill because the education spending per pupil, per weighted pupil in that community is higher than what it's been. You may see it because non-property revenues have gone down. You may see it because other districts are spending more per pupil. You may see it because there's other appropriations that are growing or being added to the education fund. But the CLA itself is not going to change the bill. It certainly may change the rate, but it's not going to be changing the bill.
Remember that line now. We had to say that a lot, yeah.
Well, I want to thank everyone very much for coming today and especially to Julia and John for their time to present and to all of you for wanting to come learn during lunch hour. We'll be right here next Friday at noon to talk about, I think, corporate taxes. So fun.